Hello, and welcome to the Wisdom Factory podcast. I'm your host, Preston, Vice President of the Wisdom Factory Literary Society. In today's podcast, we will be discussing the impact of the rise of India on the geopolitical balance of power, how this affects the United States' national security interests, and what policymakers in Washington can do to respond to the risks and opportunities presented by this situation. Turning our attention stateside, we will also be discussing the policies and platform of Libertarian candidate for governor of Texas, Mark Tippett. Should he be elected, his policies would represent a major departure from the mainstream political ideology of the two-party system. However, with long odds for victory, it's worth discussing whether or not the Libertarian Party is even viable. Join us for an important discussion about the future of politics and policy in the United States, so that way we may enlighten our understanding of the issues affecting all of us, our future, our country, and our world. All right, everyone, welcome to the Wisdom Factory podcast. We're starting off 2018's fall semester with something really exciting. This is Preston Nieves, Vice President of the Wisdom Factory. With me, I have Jordan Villanueva, the President of the Wisdom Factory.
I'm here with
and then Nicholas Flores, a member of the Wisdom Factory, is making his debut. First debut on our podcast. And what we're going to be talking about today are two topics. First of all, we're going to be talking about the strategic balance between the United States and other great powers, particularly when it comes to the role of India and United States-Russia and United States-China relations. We've talked about great power relations before. I know Jordan and I have had some wonderful discussions about that, even if we're not always on the same side of the debate.
Check the last podcast, guys.
Yeah, check the last podcast. And we're going to be sort of revisiting some of these things from a different perspective. The second issue in today's podcast is going to center around domestic politics. We're going to talk about libertarianism, specifically the party platform of Mark Tippett, the Libertarian candidate for governor of Texas, who we recently had the pleasure of meeting and having a town hall with at the Wisdom Factory's latest event.
And put the bumper on my chest.
Yeah, see, the bumper sticker is on Nick's chest right now.
Guys, right now, we know you guys don't got video feed of this, but I'm looking at Nick. He's got a Mark Tippett's Libertarian for Governor sticker right on his chest.
Let's talk about
my favorite hill figure.
Before we get into international,
because wait, let's make podcast breaking news. Because you have this on your chest, are you actually endorsing Mark Tippett, or are you just trying to be
Well,
funny?
The Wisdom Factory can't endorse candidates because we're nonpartisan, but he could.
A little bit of both, but slight more of a no because someone plastered it onto my favorite t-shirt.
A little bit of both, but no. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. Preston, so we were going to continue. We were going to start with this sort of discussion that we were having about India.
Yes.
And let me just give you guys a little bit of the background on this. So we were talking about United States geopolitical stance and our relationship with Soviet Russia and communist China. And Preston makes a valid point that we did a lot of things to nurture China, to grow China. We gave them a lot of economic incentives, a lot of economic, what would you call them, Preston? You would sort of beneficial agreements that sort of that allowed China to experience the massive growth that they have been experiencing year on year, which has then turned it in 2018 into a great economic power that in many economic metrics has surpassed the United States. And because they've surpassed us, they've become a great geopolitical enemy. So we have basically created this enemy due to our policies back in the day. How does that relate to India?
So here's sort of the conclusion we've come to, and I'll bring it back to India. So Jordan and I, and we're not going to argue about this right now, maybe we can later, but Jordan and I have some opposing views on which country is the largest threat to the United States hegemony. I believe it's
Russia.
I believe it's China.
It's Russia.
It's China. But what the conclusion we sort of came to a consensus between the three of us is that the answer is just more complicated than this one or another, and that the statement that seemed to be the most agreeable out of any single statement that we uttered was this, that militarily, Russia's the biggest threat, but economically and politically, it's China. And that the United States needs to adapt its policy based on what the deciding factors of a conflict are. Conflicts dependent on military outcomes should center around countering Russia, but conflicts centered around economic or political outcomes should focus on countering China. But here's where India comes in. India is the wild card because they have an economy that rivals China's, that rivals the United States, but they have a lot more development potential. Unlike China, they don't have a massive aging population. They have a much younger population. But on the flip side, they're also a democratic country. China's government has hated with a seething passion the United States from the very beginning of its inception. India, not so much. It's a democratic country. But at the same time, if the United States is considered about is concerned about maintaining hegemony, India's power could still be a long-term concern. And one of the things that Jordan mentioned was that we don't want to have the same mistake with India that we did with China. One of the reasons why the United States nurtured China is because we were afraid of the Soviet Union and we didn't realize what China would become. We don't want to do the same thing with India because India seems to have a lot of potential.
Right. So basically, if we we have it. So right now we're in that period of time where basically I would calculate it to where China was maybe in 85, 86. So India right now is still there's a lot of third world aspects about it. They don't really have there's a lot of bureaucratic problems. They don't have their house in order. They can't implement the policies that they need to operate in. They don't have a hugely dynamic economy like the Chinese might have had. I don't think, what are they, fourth in GDP right now?
I think somewhere
Fourth
around there.
GDP.
I can't remember the right exact
their
number.
military, their military is not formidable. They're not.
No, their military
not top
is
five.
so their military is formidable, not as much as Russia's or China's, but still a lot more than a lot of people give them credit for.
Not even more than a Saudi Arabia or Pakistan.
No. Okay, India. Not only do they have nuclear weapons, but they actually. So here's the funny part, and this is one of the reasons why it's a wild card. India has a close relationship with Russia. And what that means is they have access to Russian technological know-how, but because they have a bigger economy, unlike Russia, they can actually afford to buy the weapons that they produce in large number. So there's a lot of Russian missile technology, such as I think it's the Zircon and the Brahmos.
The S-400.
The S-400. There's a lot of missiles.
The Su-35.
There's a lot of missiles and planes that were developed either by Russia or jointly between Russia and India,
right,
where India has actually been able to adopt them a lot earlier because they can actually afford them. Now, given by and large, I would agree that the Russian military is still overall more formidable than India's.
Yes,
but
we have the fact checked in. So, what rank is India's economy?
7. It says here,
7.
according to the World Atlas,
lucky number,
India
7.
has a GDP of 2.27 trillion.
There we go.
Capita.
Boom. Thank you for giving me that number. So right now their GDP is 2.27 trillion. The United States is roughly 19 trillion, close to 20 trillion, 18 trillion.
About 20.
Somewhere in that ballpark.
Wait, are you sure is that as of now? Because I thought their economy was way bigger than that.
We have them. I think it's 2 trillion. I think that's fair to say.
But did the source have a date on it? Because I remember seeing a lot more. Because that's like closer to Russia's economy, in which case it's kind of strange. I don't know, because India legit is buying more weapons than Russia and is able to procure the new systems in a larger number. But if they have the same size economy, that's strange.
While he's working on that, it could be 2 trillion, but I know dang sure it ain't above 4 trillion in any way you're gonna look at it. So, but the point is that where India is at right now is basically we don't see them as a geopolitical threat, because their economy isn't really what China's is, or it's not what. Well, I guess China would be the only example we have right now. There's no way that
the United States, and I think
there's no. Hold on, Preston. So there's no real way that we see India as a threat in the way that we see our two main threats, which is China and Russia. But that being said, we didn't see China as the threat that we do today. Hold on, do we have that number?
I got a new one. It says here, according to the International Monetary Fund of 2017,
okay,
India at GDP nominal 2.611 trillion, which is basically 6.
So look up.
He's the
look up Russia's. I kind of want to know the comparison.
So it's a $2.7 trillion economy. So like I was saying, you look at India today. If you looked at China like in the 80s, you wouldn't see them as the geopolitical threat that they are now. So it's about sort of extrapolating what India is going to be in the future. Do we want to be having this conversation in 2030 and saying, you know what, in 2018 we could have did something about India's rise and we could have prevented them because now they're too strong, they have a stronger population, they have more innovation than us, they're a stronger democratic country than we are, so they're able to out-innovate us, and we have to sit back and take orders from India because they're a stronger geopolitical power because they own the Indian continent. So basically what we're trying to say is that do we need to reevaluate the way that we treat India given the sort of the knowledge that they could potentially be a China in the next 15 years? And if so, do we need to sort of enact policies that sort of are containing India's growth and India's potential to be the adversary that we don't want to create? Because we can create, the policies that the United States enacts towards India could either create their super powerful economy or it can stifle this super powerful economy, because basically we can control the amount of how can we control their economy, Preston?
So there's a few options that we have, but the first thing I would want to point out is that how you look at this really depends on the theory of international relations that you believe is most accurate. If you're a liberal, you probably don't care about any of this stuff because a lot of liberal, and I don't mean like liberal in terms of Democrat, that's a different thing, but like liberal in terms of foreign policy, that's just pure diplomacy and cooperation, and that a lot of them like China. But this is more of like a constructivism versus realism debate if we're conceding that China is dangerous. That I think, and same thing with India, because India, if you look at it from a constructivist perspective, there's not really anything to be afraid of with India, because India is a democratic country. They have similar ideas of what the world order should look like as the United States. So if that's your primary concern, what should world order look like? Do we want democratic or autocratic powers in countries in power? It doesn't matter. Where India is potentially dangerous is if you look at things from a realist perspective. If you're focused on power, and if you want the United States to maintain its status as a top power and prevent other countries from being able to interfere with its interests, that is where India could be extremely dangerous. Now, to constrain their economy, one of the key things has to do with how we arrange our trade deals. I know in one of our other conversations, I think an hour or so ago, you had mentioned that India has some one-sided tariffs with us too. That was part of the problem with China, is that the United States accepted trade deals that were stacked heavily in China's favor, often deliberately, and that allowed China to develop strength and self-sufficiency simultaneously, which is a very dangerous combination. With India, I think one key thing to controlling India's economy for the United States would be to promote free markets. And here's why I say that, because some people have argued with China that maybe we should just cut off trade entirely. And I'm sort of that position to an extent. But with India, it's a little bit different, because what it is that we need India's help to counter China right now. The danger is that they become strong later. So basically, if we were to promote a more of a free market relationship, we're able to keep them on our side because their economy is growing, but we limit their ability to be self-sufficient because they're not going to be able to have simultaneous comparative advantages with us in everything because of tariffs, and that's going to maintain the United States' ability to counter any kind of effort that they make to undermine our influence with sanctions. As long as they're interdependent with the rest of the world,
but
it's going to be...
But let me stop you right there. This whole point of this conversation is preventing the mistake that we made with China. What you're saying now could be applied to China when Soviet Union was a threat. We need China because we need China in the short term because we have to counter the Soviet Union.
But that's precisely where I'm coming from.
We need India because we have to counter China. You're making the same mistake twice right before us.
But the policy I'm advocating for is very different from what we did with China, because with China we made no attempt to try to have a fair trade deal. With China we made no attempt to try to put ourselves into a situation where if China got out of control, they would be interconnected and that we could retaliate with them. We never made a deliberate effort to protect our industrial capacity vis-a-vis China. That
what concessions are you going to give India in order for them to play ball when it comes time to China?
Well, this is a major opportunity for the United States because of the fact that India is so afraid of China. We might not really have to give any in terms of trade. The only concession we really would need to give potentially is security, helping protect India. And with the United States military, that's something we're prepared to do. That India and China has already threatened India with nuclear war. Things have gotten extremely serious between these two countries, especially because of their border disputes, and that as a result of that, forming an alliance with India would be something that India views as within it, in its advantage inherently, and that because of that, because the United States would be able to assist India so much in protecting it, we could get leverage in trade disputes. In fact, heck, we could even potentially forget free trade. We could try to have a non-reciprocal relationship in our favor for them, basically them paying us for our protection.
All right, but then there's also this you also have to consider as another reason that we can use as an advantage when it comes to diplomatic relations with the Indians for our side against the Chinese, and that would be the Chinese One Belt One Road initiative on their economic corridor with Pakistan,
that's a big factor,
which is also a nuclear power just across a freaking neighbor with India. And it's not just them. We also have to consider their One Belt One Road initiative throughout the maritime trade network, which just also is connected along the coastline of India.
Yeah, that is a big factor because the One Belt One Road initiative is essential for China's ability to gain long-term geopolitical influence. Because even though China right now, economically, they're the strongest country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're talking about the ability to project that economic influence abroad, and if you're talking about the ability to have a military presence abroad, that is where China falls a little bit behind the United States. Actually, a lot behind the United States in the case of the military influence abroad. And that the One Belt One Road initiative does two things. The first is that it expands China's access to other countries' markets. But the second is that because of their predatory lending policies, it allows China to establish military bases, because basically China will loan an amount of money that they know a country cannot pay. And then what will happen is that when the country defaults on the payment, China will forgive the debt in exchange for a military base.
I mean, we already see examples of this, one in Pakistan and the other one in Sri Lanka. The one in Pakistan, last time I checked, it was several decades of a lease of the port. Last time I checked, it was somewhere between 40 to 50 year lease. Now, the one in Sri Lanka, it was a 99-year lease. Now, mind you, the one in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan, right now, there's not a lot going on. There's not a lot of trade going on. There's barely anything. And if you look it up, there's almost no cargo ships that go there. But that's only the beginning. It's only been just fixed. So we'll have to see what happens.
I feel like we're getting sort of off topic here. We're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and how that benefits China. This specifically is about countering India.
But it is relevant to the strategic balance, because one of the things that needs to be considered. There's two things that need to be considered. Not only China versus India,
because you're making me want to go into my counter Russia's Belt and Road Initiative.
But also, you mean China's Belt and Road Initiative? But okay. Yeah. But the thing is that Russia. One thing that needs to be considered is not only China versus India, but also long term versus short term. And I think this is where the United States oftentimes makes bad judgment. Is that like with China is that we had short term thinking that we were not willing to consider what China could eventually become. We were only concerned about what would happen within the term of the president and the congressmen that were there at that time. Well, the whole point of this conversation is avoiding the same mistake with India, and because I think we're all in agreement here that in the short term, India is not as dangerous as China or Russia, but in the long term, they definitely could be potentially more dangerous than either.
Well, you could say yes, that it would be that dangerous, but then you'd also have to consider this, that both India and America, they will probably stick more with short-term policies strictly by the fact that they're democracies versus China, because with China, it's more authoritarian. They're closer to the older governments that used to exist, for instance, like monarchies or empires, where if they had one goal, they could stick to it, no problem.
There was a book.
However, with a democracy, for the people that are elected to stay in power, they have to get the public, the popular vote, basically, or public opinion, to keep them in power. And with that, people are more short-sighted. They have short attention spans. When you do that, it's much harder to continue with the long-range plan unless you know there is an enemy out there that we all agree on.
That's a very valid point. And I mean, you're totally right that there's a fundamental difference in the long-term strategies that you see with democracies versus sort of more authoritarian governments like you see in Russia and China. That's why they're able to implement these 5 and 10-year, 20-year plans. And we just simply could not do that because we implement 1-year, 6-month plans. You know,
we can barely do a 5.
We don't have we don't have long-term planning. It's not built into
Pull
our
a Kennedy.
system.
We choose to go to the moon
before this decade is out.
Long-term planning entails sacrifices in the short term, and in democracies, you rarely ever see that because it costs you political capital. But that being said, I want to sort of talk about let's look at this, because a lot of time when we have these discussions, we get boggled down in looking at this from an American gun-ho perspective. We need to look at this from an Indian perspective. What's in India's best interest to do? We need to calculate it from that perspective. I think it's at least important to entertain what does India gain from being sort of aligning its interest with America versus Russia and India. And I would say that the only two big things that countries like India would need to follow is a security interest and an economic interest. They're a democracy. They must be safe and protect their integrity, and they must have jobs, and they must ensure that their growing population is fed, and that they have an opportunity to sort of rise above the lower classes and sort of become and achieve economic empowerment. So basically, if Russia and China, which I think Russia can provide an alternative in security, and China can provide an alternative in economics. So basically, we could lose our leverage in those two main areas, and so India wouldn't need to be aligned with us as strong. They don't need us. Or they can at least afford to pivot towards.
Well, India has other options,
and they've already started that, Preston. And when they have the ability to do that, your ability to command India and say jump and them say how high becomes limited. And we've already seen evidence of that with the purchasing of this S-400. We just sanctioned China for buying Russian weapons.
Yeah.
India, not even a month later, buys the Su-400, saying, America, what are you going to do? The ball's in the S-400. What are you going to do? We just bought these weapons. We're going to have them because we have strategic autonomy. They did not listen. They knew that we explicitly didn't want them to do this.
If we're going to look at this, if we're going to look at this from India's perspective, there's sort of two things that need to be considered. One of which lends itself towards kind of an optimistic American view, another not so much. So when it comes to India and what their view of the world order is like, and what they would see as their benefit from cooperating with the United States, I would say the one thing that really could form a lot of grounds for cooperation between India and the United States is the fact that they're both democratic countries. That India and the United States don't really have that many differences in terms of what they want the international order to look like. They are both democratic countries that believe in rule of law. That's why they're both countering China. That they believe, for example, that the ocean should be an open resource for mankind, and that there should be freedom of navigation through international waters. So India and the United States, I don't really see, in terms of the way the world order is structured, them having competing goals. At least not yet. If we get into some of the long-term arguments, maybe we could make more of a compelling case for rivalry. But here's the thing. Here's the thing where India could get dangerous, and you mentioned it: strategic autonomy. Particularly because the United States has tried to violate that strategic autonomy by threatening to put sanctions on them as a result of them buying Russian weapons. And if China or Russia is willing to give them strategic autonomy, which is basically independence from the influence of other great powers, in an instance where the United States is not, that could pull India de facto into the influence of China and Russia.
Well, there's also something you're going to have to pull up as well if we were to talk about from India's point of view. Let's talk about the S-400s, for instance. I mean, think about this. In your position, would you want to buy weapons that are just as good as American and possibly cheaper?
Yep.
And you also get good relationships with a nation that is on the same continent as you.
American weapons are overpriced. That's something we need to come back to.
They're just as good. However, they're more expensive, and you have to go through more hurdles just to get a hold of them.
Sometimes we pay for you to have. We give.
Well, you
well,
can,
also,
but that depends on the
situation. And also, one thing,
well,
you mentioned about going through hurdles. That's actually a really important point, because basically what the United States does now is what the Russians used to do. So, an example of this. So, and I'll tie it back. Don't worry. But this is an important historical fact to understand. So, one of the reasons why the T-72s performed so poorly in the Iraq War, the Saddam's T-72s, is because they arguably were not even real T-72s. They were monkey models. They were the type that Russia exported to countries it didn't trust.
Right.
And what it is that was a common thing the Soviet Union did, is that they would export less capable variants of their weapon systems to other countries. The United States, more recently, and we did it then too, but more now, has done something similar. That there's a lot of weapon systems, like for example, countries can buy the F-35 but not the F-22. The F-35 is fine for low-intensity conflict, is fine against primitive adversaries, is fine, albeit excessively expensive, for counterterrorism. But if you want to fight an enemy's air superiority fighter, the F-35 is not designed for air combat. It's a joint strike fighter. They tried to force it into the multi-role platform, which is part of why it's so expensive. But air-to-air combat is not its strong suit. And I know, Jordan, we've had debates about the F-35. It does have better sensors, but it's not going to be able to do beyond visual range in a electronic warfare intense environment. That's why one of the reasons why dogfighting is still relevant, because even though modern planes have beyond visual range capability, that when you encounter electronic warfare that messes with your sensors, sometimes you're not going to be able to shoot until they're a lot closer. But my point in bringing all this stuff up, us exporting the F-35 and not the F-22, putting, like, for example, the Abrams tanks, a lot of the Abrams tanks we exported don't have depleted uranium armor, is because the United States has all sorts. Not only is our weapons much more expensive because of the defense industrial complex here, but also that we have a lot of the characteristics and capabilities that make our weapons worth having, we're not willing to offer to a lot of export customers. Russia, on the other hand, because they're strapped for cash, well, we're the most indebted nation in human history, but because of the petrodollar, we can spend more. That might be another podcast topic.
Yeah.
But with Russia, because they're in need of money, that they're willing to sell some of their more capable weapon systems to other countries. Look at the Su-57, for example. Russia's not buying a lot of Su-57s, but the Su-57 is on sale for other countries to buy if they want them in their air force. The Su-57 is head and shoulders above the F-35. It's more like the F-22 in terms of capability. So that it kind of tying this back to India. That India definitely sees a benefit in buying Russian weapons because they have more options. They're able to get more capability for less, and because when they actually buy the capability, Russia is willing to sell them the full variant, the full fat Russian variant of a weapon, as opposed to some monkey model that's specifically designed to be less capable or not selling certain weapon systems. So, as an example, us not selling the F-22 but selling the F-35, that would be almost like if Russia said, we'll sell you the Su-35 but not the Su-57.
Well, there's also the one where you got to consider that if you can look at least in recent years, American weapons, up until recently, is one of the best, if not the best, until recently, best weapon systems in existence.
Well, I would say they're still even now I would say they're among the best. It's just the problem. There's two problems.
Sell our best.
That's the thing. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Not just that, but also there's two things. That A, they've gotten a lot more overpriced, and B, technological advantage has closed, because there was a time, like in the 1990s, where even our downgraded export models were better than the top-of-the-line weapons that Russia or China could produce.
Yes.
That is no longer the case.
Not
only are Russia and China just fundamentally ahead of us in certain technologies like missiles, but even in the areas where they're behind, their best stuff is better than our export models.
Now, well, I just want to sort of backtrack a little bit, because this whole theme is not making the same mistake twice with India that we made with China. And one of the things that you said, Preston, although to your credit you did clarify this, but I just want to emphasize, is that you said right now, I guess you're sort of admitting that Russia can provide a security alternative to the United States because of the reasons you guys just talked about, and China can preserve an economic alternative, or they can present an economic alternative, because they're going to be a greater economic power, and they're right next to them, and they have this Belt and Road Initiative where they're creating all sorts of infrastructure in the region. But you said, well, we still have the fact that we're both democratic, and that India has no fundamental differences in us when it comes to the worldview and to the liberal order. Now, I would say that this is not actually the case. And we shouldn't make this mistake, because if you look at every single great power in the history of the world, you will see that China didn't have no great fundamental difference with us, maybe in the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah, they did. They were communists, we were not.
They were communists and we were not. We had different governments. But they didn't say we should get rid of the UN. We should get rid of the IMF. We should get rid of...
Well, actually, Mao Zedong and a lot of the early Chinese leaders were talking about that. They just didn't have the power to actually make it come to fruition.
Exactly, and that's what I'm trying to say. So you don't really know what a country wants to do until it's powerful enough to do what it wants to do. So we don't know what sort of designs India may have for the world order. Because if India had the power to reshape the world in its own image, it definitely would do so. It would want to do so in a way where India has as much, because countries, when they have the economic power and they have the military power, they want the geopolitical power. But you have to force that to happen. That's what you're seeing with China right now. So China was a very, I wouldn't say peaceful nation, but they weren't exactly aggressive geopolitically, maybe economically, but not geopolitically up until recently, where we see them trying to expand in the South China Sea. We see them trying to expand in the Western, into the countries in Asia. Now we're seeing China actually take on a more active geopolitical role. You see what they're doing in Africa. So we don't know that India is not going to do this once they become powerful enough to do so. Once they have the economic resources to do it, once they have the military to sort of push their weight around, then we can see what their true vision is for the world order. Well, we can't say because they don't have the capability now that they don't have these motives.
Well, that's definitely a very realist perspective. And given, I'm not saying to disagree, because I've always been a realist, so I definitely see the.
But every country has done that.
I definitely let me see, and that's one of the reasons why I'm a realist. Okay, I see the validity in your argument that what it is, and I think, and this kind of goes back to the long-term, short-term thing I was talking about. That what it is that. We don't want to make an argument based off of an unknown from a constructivist perspective, and I'll get into this a little bit later. From a constructivist perspective, there is no evidence in this moment. Yes, we could speculate about what might happen, but there's no evidence at this point in time that India just wants to completely reinvent the world order compared to what it is. I think I like Nick's example of the British Empire versus the United States. But I do agree with you on a realist framework, in the sense that if we are going to focus on power, that gives us the liberty to speculate about what a country might do when it is in power.
You could say
and that is something that I think, and that's the whole point of having this podcast, essentially.
You could look at Brazil and say Brazil has no designs in the world order. You could look at Mexico. Mexico has no designs in the world order. Japan has no designs in the world order. But if you gave that country the economic power to where it was the second strongest in the world or the first strongest in the world, and
or
the military,
even the first eight.
and the military power to be the first or second strongest, I guarantee you that they would then come up with something, or they would then sort of expose their true intentions.
Well, and I think we need to kind of dive into why I use the word fundamental, because I am under no illusion that there would be some differences between an Indian world order and an American world order. Mm-hmm. When I say fundamental, I mean talking about things like democracy, human rights, and rule of law. That those are all things that China is completely against. China, they can't stand democracy. They don't believe in rule of law, and they view human rights conventions and like anti-genocide stuff as like terrible. Like they can't stand it. Well, India is not necessarily like that, So when I say fundamental, I'm talking about how the world order is structured.
There was no evidence, Preston, and you want to talk about that? I'll give you one. No, they believe in strategic autonomy.
I agree with that.
If they were a world power, they would probably then extend that to every country in the world who wanted to have strategic autonomy, because that's something that they believe in. So therefore, every country should have strategic autonomy. We don't believe that.
Yeah, no. But Jordan, what I'm.
Hold on. I disagree with you, Jordan, on that, because the United States has had that before. The British have had that before. The British have had that so that they can protect themselves with a big-ass navy.
Yes, but do they allow other
with the Americans,
countries?
It was the Monroe Doctrine.
Yep. Okay. But we're saying, exactly. The Monroe Doctrine is the point. We are not going to allow Mexico or Belize or El Salvador to achieve nuclear weapons and to achieve a superior navy, because the United States is going to protect everyone else. That's our fundamental belief, that you don't need guns because America is going to be the world police.
America.
We believe that. That's why we're not going to allow China to weaponize the South China Sea, because we already protect it. India, when you talk about strategic autonomy, you can't say we're going to have strategic autonomy, but you can't. That's not something that we believe in. That's something that they believe in. So if you believe in strategic autonomy for yourself, you believe in strategic autonomy for every country that's in the world. And so what is that going to lead to? Every country is going to increase their military might, their weaponry, their capacity, their military readiness, because that's something that India believes in, that the world is a better place when everyone can have as strong as a military as they want to have. Preston, I know you can't agree with this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's actually one of the reasons why I make the distinction.
But that's just one of the fundamental differences in our worldview that does exist. You said there's no evidence for it. That's something that does exist.
Well, when I'm saying, here's the thing: it's inevitable that countries are going to have different interests. When I say fundamental worldview in this context, I'm talking about their views on what the laws and norms governing relations between nations should look like. So here's the thing, is that the difference between India and the United States has more to do with how India conducts its own foreign policy versus how the United States conducts its own foreign policy. That the United States and India are more or less in agreement of the idea of, for example, that international waters should be free and open to navigate to any country, right? That's something that we agree upon, at least as far as what we know now and what can be proven. With China, that's not the case. With China, that they just believe that they own the South China Sea. They believe that China's interests are just inherently superior to the interests of other countries, partially because of Middle Kingdom ideology, partially because of Chinese communist propaganda, what have you. There's all sorts of reasons. But the point is that, now this is not to say that there's no fundamental differences in the United States and India, because when I say there's no fundamental differences, can you get me another one, Jordan? When I say there's no fundamental differences between another Coke. But when I say there's no fundamental differences between the United States and India, I am talking specifically about world order and international law. If you're talking about the interests of the countries and sort of what they do in terms of their own foreign policy, outside of what they think other countries should do, that's where there definitely are major differences. Because strategic autonomy with India is quite different from with the United States. Now, given the United States does have a degree of strategic autonomy in the sense that we don't want other countries interfering with us. However, we don't have strategic autonomy in the sense that we don't want to just align with one side or the other. India buys weapons from the United States and Russia. And the only reason why they're hostile with China is because China's been really antagonizing them. That India is more willing to act sort of as an independent entity, and that you're absolutely right. What you were alluding to earlier, Jordan, was a multipolar world. That the idea that instead of having two great powers or one great power, you have multiple great powers, and that might be more in line with what India wants. However, that would raise a question, is that, would India really be satisfied with that in the long term? Because the whole point of having this conversation is whether or not India has ambitions to become the sole power. Well, in the short to midterm, it might be fine with a multipolar world.
I don't know if you said this, but this is like going to your point. This is sort of supplementing your point that you just made. And you said this before, Preston. So the reason why we're looking at India in this kind of way is because you said their GDP is 2.1 trillion. Right now, that's not that bad. That's not something.
Wait, you said India's? Well, India's now it's more like a almost 2.7. 2.7. Russia's is like 1.5.
Right, 2.7. Yeah. But I think we're all in agreement here that Russia's population is going to surpass China's. And their economic...
You said India or Russia?
India.
You said Russia.
India's population is going to surpass China.
You did say Russia, but it's India.
Why do I keep saying Russia? What's wrong with it?
It's okay. Russia's population is shrinking, so that's okay.
Because you're terrified of Russia. You just talk about Russia.
I have nightmares.
That's the thing. I think Jordan's motto at this point could be, the Russians are coming. The Russians are coming.
Well, I mean, if it's Russian women, I'm fine with them coming, but that's a different story.
Dude, chill out, man. Okay.
I'm kidding.
Dude, all right. So the Wisdom Factory is not. The Wisdom Factory is not sexist.
No, we're not.
Nor have we ever been sexist.
Nor Nick was just making a joke.
Yeah.
Now, if you would like to see us, please send to PO Box 2125. No, I was kidding. So, anyway, guys, he likes women. Sue him. Sue him. He likes women. I like
Nicholas
women.
Flores.
Sorry,
Preston likes women, but we don't objectify.
I'm having a sugar rush, guys. My mind is weird, okay?
But we all agree that we should never objectify women. But there's nothing wrong with saying that she's pretty.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so let's continue.
Back to the India.
Let's continue. So.
Well, what about Indian girls?
Man, I forgot.
Oh my gosh. Anyway.
All right. Okay.
As I was going to say, for the short and even to the mid game, like let's just put it.
Oh no. Let me clarify. Let me finish. That was what I was going to say before you did that thing. So we know that India's population is set to surpass China's. Not only are they going to surpass China's, they're going to be much younger. Maybe, what is it, like 20 years younger?
Yeah, because China's population, even if it's not surpassed by India's, is still going to be a lot older.
It's going to be a lot older. And when it's older, that means that more people are leaving the labor market. than is being put into the labor market, and therefore you're going to naturally see a downward trend on economic growth. It doesn't mean that you'll see lower GDP numbers, but there will be less potential for growth, whereas in India, where you have more and more and more people entering the labor market, it's going to be a different situation, and that's why you see economists believe that India is going to achieve either second or first economy at least by 2040.
Yeah, because
and so during this conversation, we want you to keep in mind that India is going to become A, the most populous, and B, the largest economy potentially. And that's why we're worried about them.
Yeah, well, and I think China knows this too, and this is actually something that could be particularly concerning in terms of the security relationship, because you know how earlier I had mentioned this was around the same time that the North Korea stuff was going on, which is why it was overshadowed. But you know how earlier I mentioned that China had threatened to wage nuclear war against India over that border dispute?
Oh yeah.
Here's the scary thing.
Wasn't that in the 60s?
No, that was in the 60s, but also now. But the 60s was against Russia. But here's the thing that's scary about that. Because right now, China is controlled by ultra-nationalist leaders like Xi Jinping. Mm-hmm. So the propaganda will not spin it this way. The United States propaganda will not spin it this way. But if you look at purely aggression and ideology, the Chinese Communist Party right now it's like Nazis. It's like Hitler. It's very no. I'm serious.
Well,
it is in terms. Let me finish what I was going to say. In terms
you
of
got to clarify.
No, it is, and the reason why is because of the fact that there's such a basis. There's such an emphasis on cultural exceptionalism, that the idea of the Middle Kingdom, which is something that is historically existed in Chinese culture, has influenced Chinese Communist has influenced Chinese Communist Party ideology. Jordan, let me finish. Why do you think they fundamentally believe that they are superior to the rest of mankind, which is very, 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 very terrifying.
I mean, if you look at it historically, they were called the Middle Kingdom. Heck, even their emperor, according to, if I remember, I don't know if it was Confucian or Taoist or something.
But here's why I mentioned that. After you're done, I need to explain why I mentioned that.
Yes, because the thing is, another term that they used was called the mandate of heaven.
Okay.
And for them, they saw the ruler as nearly divine. Now, mind you, that was back in the time when it was a monarchy-like system.
Right.
But, however, they saw their government, the regime, as something that was divine, something that was given by God, similar to the Europeans' view of the divine right.
Philosophy continues to influence more modern
thought.
But
Nicholas, China is a state-controlled society where religion is not allowed, or an idea and sort of a deity is not allowed. Ever since Chinese legalism has come around, which has been after what you're talking about, there's no basis of no one believes that Xi Jinping is divine. No one believes
You're
that.
right.
Now, hold on, Preston. Now you can say that China believes they are exceptional people, that their race is a superior race. There's two problems with that. A, every single country and every single race believes that. Every single society has a term called barbarian, which means the other. They are uncivilized. We are the only civilized nation. Every country has that. Now that's basically the whole basis for imperialism, for the European imperialism. Now, B.
Can't remember B. All right, no. Let me. Here's. I want to explain why I was bringing this up, because the thing is.
No. Here's B. I got B. Let me get B.
All right, get B.
So B.
The bees are going extinct. We gotta save them.
Man, I missed.
So B. There's a difference in believing that your race is superior, and when you compare them to Hitler, who believed his race was superior. So okay, so far you're so good, but who believes that because you're superior, that you have the right to systematically exterminate any other race who was other than yours. The Chinese are not doing that.
No.
The Chinese have killed more people than Hitler and Stalin combined.
They killed more Chinese people.
But here's what I was going to say is that there is a difference. I said cultural exceptionalism, not racial exceptionalism. China believes that their people are superior based on culture, not based on race. So there is a difference. But I'm talking about it in terms, of how dangerous it could be and how ultranationalistic. But here's my point in bringing this up, that. Because yes, every country has sort of this noble lie, this idea that they're superior, but not every country has a government that embodies that. For example, even in the United States, Trump is nationalist, but A, he's not as ultra nationalist as Xi, and B, you have a lot of liberals who are to a certain extent, I'm not sure I want to say anti-US because that would be kind of untrue, but like sort of pro, like basically this idea that we need to like, you know, to have reparations for colonialism and stuff. So a lot of other countries is more moderated. With China, it's raw nationalism. And here's my point in bringing this up relative to India. Because China is so nationalistic, their government, not necessarily their people as a whole, but their government would be the type to try to see that India is a potential economic threat, and as a result, use economic or military or both action to try to constrain the ability of India to grow in the future, because they know that if they allow India to grow unimpeded, that China will not be able to be the primary power, because that's essentially the goal of the Communist Party. They want to replace the United States, and they want to prevent anybody else from replacing the United States instead of China.
Now, I remember I remember reading a couple of articles that stated, I believe it was from The Diplomat and a couple of others, that they stated that the Indians already knew about this sort of thing happening ever since their relationship with Pakistan. Now, that is why they decided, as of 2017, although this happened, there were talks about this back in 2007, that they would create this dialogue or security group called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which was introduced by Japan back in 2006, 2007-ish. But it eventually dissolved, partially because Australia backed out of it. But now, as of 2017, Australia, Japan, United States, and India have decided to revive this dialogue together, partially in response to China with its One Belt, One Road, or String of Pearls, which this is involving the naval bases, the String of Pearls. Now, this could be an interesting way. Now, I would say that this is good for the United States if we're talking about keeping the Indians on our side, at least in the short and mid-term goals. Now, long-term, well, that's in the long term. That's kind of hard to predict, because we could say India could become a threat. I mean, there was that rivalry with the British and the Americans. I like bringing them up so much because the British were the original idea of what a global superpower was versus rising powers.
And it presents a case where it's a foil to what we're talking about, right? So basically, in this situation, we would be the British Empire, and India would be the America, the young up-and-coming power that's going to soon take over the world.
Perfect analogy.
But for the British Empire, it worked out pretty well for them. Having America become the world's leader, the world's power, we've actually we've saved them twice, and we've sort of been able to guarantee that, you know, even without an empire, they're still protected as if they still had the empire.
Right, so and they're still relatively
we're a security guarantor, we're an economic guarantor, and man, what would United Kingdom be if they didn't have the United States power backing them up? Probably nothing.
Scotland would probably be free. No, just kidding.
You know, England would. I mean, they wouldn't be what they are today. England has. They wouldn't even be in the UN Security Council.
England would be Her Royal Highness would be royally fucked. That's what basically what would happen.
Oh man,
we're sorry, Queen. If you're listening, Queen, God save you.
We do love your dogs. Okay, they are very adorable.
So, but to your credit, it's possible that India could be the next United States. And that they do believe in human rights, and they do believe in human dignity, and they will use their power for the benefit of mankind.
Wait, I thought you were going to keep that on the whole night.
Yeah, what are you doing?
The night is over.
No, it's not. It's still night time.
No,
it's
still night time.
Sure.
He's taking off the Mark Tippett.
No.
You can't do that.
You can't do that. You got to, okay, at least keep it on until the podcast is over.
It's already past the time. I should take it off.
Yeah. What are you?
What? This is my favorite Hilfiger shirt.
Don't be making spontaneous.
I love Hilfiger.
Okay, that's
and live with the consequences of your actions, Nick.
So,
dang it.
So basically, there is a possibility that India is going to be a good power, and that we should encourage their rise because they're going to serve as an auxiliary to us and our ability to project power.
I guess a bulwark would be a good word.
A bulwark and our ability to sort of secure our interests. And our interests are best secured with a powerful India. But that being said,
But yeah, because I was about to say, to argue from a realist perspective, do you really want United States success in foreign policy to be dependent on India? Because we must remember that even though the British Empire had it pretty good under the United States, there were instances where that was not always the case. Like for example, I think it was the Suez Crisis.
Oh yeah, that's a very good example.
The Suez Crisis, basically the long and short of the Suez Crisis was Britain could not project power without American permission. Do we want that? Do we want a situation where the United States cannot project power without Indian permission?
That is problematic.
But Preston, you're right. So we would need their permission in some areas, but it's not like they're actively trying to sort of violate our.
I wouldn't depend on them specifically.
That is true.
In a way that, but so what I wanted to get into is because I think we need to shift into the next gear of this conversation. What are the things that you guys think that we should be looking for to prove that we are making the same mistake and India is on a path towards a situation where they are powerful, A, and B, we can't control them? I would say what you would want to look for is the military exercises with China and Russia, more purchases of Russian military weapons, and
I would say more outgoing nature
of saying that what America does, we're not going to listen because we have our own interests. That shows you that they're not going to sort of play ball when we ask them to play ball. C, I would say more economic integration with China. D, I would say you watch the rhetoric of their president. I think it's very important. You have to see what their president is saying. Right. You have to see what is the national line, because like Preston said, right now there's really no evidence outside of like maybe strategic autonomy and some other things about a fundamental difference in worldview. So you need to watch for that to evolve as their power evolves. Mm-hmm. Watch their language evolve.
Yeah, because countries can change, similar to how countries change, and I totally agree with that. That what it is that like one of the things I had mentioned is that part of the problem with the United States foreign policy towards China is that it's frozen in time in a lot of ways, or it was. Trump has changed it obviously, but what it is that for the longest time we were acting as if Russia was still the preeminent Soviet threat and China was a third world country, and in reality that was not the case. We need to avoid making the same mistake with India, that just because India right now is a country we want to help and a country that's useful to balancing China does not mean that India will always be that, and that, let's say hypothetically, let's imagine that the Chinese economy collapses and that they're no longer a threat. Mm-hmm. We would have to readjust our strategy towards India.
Well, I guess a good example.
But hold on, Nick, because I don't want to get off this. So I'm giving lists about things that we need to watch for during the next maybe decade, to make sure that India is on the right path, and because they're going to be powerful, and because they're going to be they might have different interests, they could potentially be an enemy. So another thing that we need to watch for is their military spending. We need to sort of monitor how their military is growing. Where are they putting their military assets? Are they trying to sort of, because it's pretty obvious when they buy a S-400, to me, that sends a message that we have the ability to shoot down F-22s and F-35s, and we can.
Because S-400 can kill stealth aircraft.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
No, they can, but it's
actually. I had a conversation with Dr. Inbody, and he's way more confident in stealth than you are, Preston. He believes that stealth cannot be detected the way that you think it can be detected,
at least in its current form.
And
the
thing
you gotta and here's what I'm saying is that
that's a whole other conversation.
I'm talking about specific because you mentioned S-400. So the thing with stealth is that, first of all, it can be detected at closer distances, and then second of all, one thing that people often overlook are passive emissions. That basically a lot of times, like the early stealth aircraft that are designed only for bombing would not have radar on, or if they did, it'd be weaker or something like that. A lot of radars, a lot of fighter jets, they have like the targeting radar. It's similar to HARM missiles. You can home in on that. But you're right, that's a topic for a different discussion. But my point is though, is that with the S-400, the S-400 is actually able to detect and target stealth aircraft. Whether or not that can actually shoot it down maybe is a good point for debate. Yep. But the S-400, what makes it unique and what makes it better compared to a lot of other missile defense systems is its capability against stealth aircraft, is the fact that stealth aircraft are not invulnerable against the S-400 like they are against some older systems.
Is it possible for S-400s to strike down stealth aircraft? Yes. But does it render stealth aircraft ineffective?
Well, no, those are two different questions.
Yes, but those are still two fundamentally. If your capability is not ineffective,
like a stealth aircraft will always be harder to detect than a non-stealth, but you can still have situations where both will be shot down easily.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But it's in this situation, I would disagree. But that's a whole other topic for another situation. But we're talking about sort of things that you should look for in India's sort of foreign policy. Another thing that I would say is very, very important is sort of the nature and the spirit of their agreements with our adversaries. That's something that you need to look at. That's very concrete. We can point to and saying, well, look, they're dealing with Iran. They're dealing with Venezuela. They're dealing with North Korea. They're dealing with Russia. They're dealing with China and all of our other enemies. And that's something that we should be looking out for. If there's an increase in the volume of trade agreements or just sort of geopolitical agreements with our adversaries, we need to be worried about that. And after that, I would just say we monitor their culture. We monitor the videos, the music, and make sure that there's not much anti-American, pro-Russian, and China rhetoric. And other than that, that's all I got. What sort of things do you guys think we should be looking out for from India to confirm our suspicions that they may be on a path beyond our control?
Well, one thing I would definitely say is mercantilism, because that's been the key to China's success is mercantilism. I think that India, if they're willing to adopt free markets and international trade, that's a sign that they're willing to uphold a liberal world order, that they support interconnectedness, that they don't have a lot of unilateral aggression, because they're willing to be interdependent enough with the rest of the world where they're going to be dependent on us to provide key resources for their economy, and where they recognize that if they were to go to war, it would be economically detrimental to them. So I would definitely watch for mercantilism, because that's what I just explained under the free market. If India starts moving towards efforts to become economically self-sufficient, if India starts moving towards efforts to prepare its economy for war, as China has, because China's done both. They've militarized their economy, and they've also become a lot more self-sufficient. Those would definitely both be indicators to watch out for. So what I always say is that, we need to definitely prioritize free trade agreements with India, getting them to lower tariffs. And if we have to lower tariffs, if we have to lower tariffs, that's fine. We just want to get them to lower their tariffs, and we want to be reciprocal. That free trade is the goal with India in a lot of ways, because that maintains their interdependence on us. And that since they're democratic, they're more likely to embrace free trade. But the point is that if India starts getting
nuke India.
The point is, like, if India starts getting mercantilist, especially if they're mercantilists in the face of alternatives. So let's say that we offer them a free trade deal. We say, you get rid of all your tariffs, we'll get rid of all of ours. If they reject that, and then they reject that in favor of a more mercantilist agreement that would give them lopsided advantages, that's a red flag that they have major ambitions to become a world power at the expense of the United States. Because if they want to coexist with the United States and share power, free trade is going to be great for them. But if they want to take over the world, or if they want to be the world's hegemon, then they don't want free trade, they want mercantilism.
I would say at least two things. One's probably going to be the most obvious, but then the other one's going to be a little more interesting. The first one would be more like their movements, what they have been doing in terms of military or even economic. What I'm saying is when they start acting out in the theaters around the Indian Ocean, for instance, say anti-piracy, they start getting more active in there. We could say maybe like what Preston said earlier with mercantilism, when they start getting involved in a mercantilist fashion with their neighboring states, nations like Burma, Thailand, Bangladesh, or predominantly Eastern Africa. That would be an interesting way to look at. Now, the second one would be more like an indicator to start watching the Indians for what they do. And what I'm saying is probably going to be one of the few limiters that the Indians have, besides their corruption, obviously. It would be their caste system. Their caste system still exists. Mind you, it's weaker than what it used to be, but it's been part of their culture for so long, it is still very much ingrained.
It's still a basis for mass discrimination.
Yeah. It's still a massive one. So we'll have to watch that. See the progress in that. Once we start seeing that, because like I said before, this is a limiter.
We need to have a human rights podcast.
We do.
This is a
need to have a human rights podcast.
Like this is what I'm saying. It's a limiter. It's restricting them. It's holding them back. Once you see that, either at least half of it gone, or when it's nearly non-existent or insignificant, that's when you should start watching what the Indians are doing, because this is just something that's keeping them occupied. Once it's gone, they can do more. You see where I'm coming from at this?
Which one? What are you doing?
Nick's dropping the fucking heat, man.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He's dropping the fucking heat. You're making me mad that I missed what you're talking about.
Right?
We're all getting tired. So I think we're all getting tired at this point. So I do want to move on to the second segment of the podcast.
We're barely on the.
Yeah.